Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We have a great episode for you this week. We'll be discussing Israeli politics and the election and a lot more. And for that purpose, I'm delighted to be joined once again by Dan Rothem, a senior policy analyst here at IPF and a longtime expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as Shira Efron, our former colleague, who is currently a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and their distinguished Israel policy chair. I wanted Shira and Dan back on this week to help provide a fully Israel-based perspective on how the election campaign is shaping up and how it feels right now in Israel, including the rise of Gadi Eisenkot as the main challenger to Bibi Netanyahu. And afterwards, we also touched on the big news regarding a U.S. Saudi nuclear deal and the latest on Gaza. What we didn't talk about, this time at least, is the ongoing and escalating tensions with Iran. For that, you can check out the deep dive I did with Nesan Rafati in last week's podcast. But needless to say, things haven't gotten better since we recorded last week, and things may actually be set to get worse. Everyone in Israel obviously is watching things warily. It's obviously in the ether and on people's minds here. But so far, Israel hasn't been dragged in, or conversely, hasn't been asked by the U.S. to actively and actually get involved. We'll see if all those things remain true and actually hold in the coming days. But like I said, this was a terrific episode with Shira and Dan. So for now, put Iran out of your mind and just sit back and relax wherever you're listening or watching this podcast, on the beach, by the pool, or dare I say, commuting to work and cursing everyone who's already on vacation. Don't worry, you're all very much seen and very much thought of. So with all that, let's get to Dan and Shira. Hi, Shira. Hi, Dan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Neri. Hi, Dan.
Hey, guys. Good to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you both back on. Dan, you'll be very familiar with this phrase. You're pinch hitting this week for our dear friend and colleague Michael Koplow, who usually comes on with Shira and I. But don't feel too bad about it, because Shira missed the last time Michael was on, and we brought in our other colleague Rachel Brandenburg to pinch hit for Shira. So I have to make things fair and balanced. You two wouldn't know anything about it, but when you have children, podcast children, you have to make it kind of equal. I'm kidding. You both have both have children, obviously. So thank you both for coming on.
I mean, I wouldn't know. Michael and Dan, they have the same exact hairstyle, and you fooled me.
The Israeli Koplow. We don't, as a general rule, Shira, we don't talk about hair on this podcast. We talk about Israeli politics and policy. We steer clear of talk about follicles. But your hair is looking wonderful. Your hair is looking wonderful today, Shira, as always. So all kidding aside, what I wanted to do this week is to kind of give our audience a real perspective from here in Israel about the main issues of the day, primarily relating to Israeli politics and the now election campaign. But we'll definitely get into more of the geopolitics and security issues in the second half of the episode, trust me. So Shira, let's start here. We're now officially in election mode. We have less than 100 days until October 7th, or October 27th, rather, which is election day. Freudian slip. And the big news of recent weeks and recent months is this rise of former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, who we both know well. He's now rising in the polls and has become the main challenger to Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud. So I guess, the big question, the first question, what do we think of Eisenkot's rise?
So just have to say with the caveat of having known Gadi Eisenkot, through professional circles, but for quite a number of years, I'm a huge fan. So this doesn't just going to put this aside, that regardless if he becomes the prime minister or not, we're speaking about, a leader, a person with values, and a lot of modesty. And I'm just going to give an anecdote here that I think would maybe you would appreciate. A few years ago, I organized a conference and I had him as a guest speaker. It was about sort of like how climate change will affect national security when I was trying to do these things. Yet he was just going to give like an opening remarks, really not main professional, he wasn't supposed to give a professional brief on, a climate change forecast for the century. And this is a guy who was the chief of staff, right? Was Netanyahu's military secretary. He's been in wars all his life. And he calls me at around 10 p.m. He's like, can you talk? And I said, yeah, of course. And he's like, I'm not sure what to say. Gadi, I'm sorry. But he was just like, it showed the degree of humility and professionalism that he wanted to deepen and not just come there and check a box, because he takes things really professionally. And for me, this was something that I hold him really high regard, because I feel like he's eager to learn and he wants to work with professionals, and he knows exactly what he knows, which is a lot. And I think also what he doesn't know. You wrote a great profile about Gadi Eisenkot in the Financial Times. So those of you who can go past the paywall, I encourage you to read it, what Neri just wrote. But I think it's basically, he's the anti-Bibi, right?
Yeah, the anti-Netanyahu, the anti-politician.
The anti-Netanyahu, yeah. And I think it's a really good description in a sense that he looks more modest. He has this aura about him that when he walks around, people can say, oh, he doesn't have this sort of like American polish to him, if you will, that Netanyahu has so well. And I think some people here say that he doesn't look like he has the killer instinct, which obviously they don't know him. You don't become the chief of staff of the IDF if you don't have the killer instinct, right? So he's been there. And of course, his personal sacrifices, having lost a son in the war in Gaza and a nephew.
Two nephews.
But not only that, having sacrificed all his...
Two nephews.
Two nephews, right. Two nephews. And his son, and having sacrificed all his life for public service, and he's genuine. And I think what you are seeing is that, and we can talk more about, sort of the polling and how things are, because in terms of the changes in blocks and who would able to form a government, if it's the Netanyahu bloc or the anti-Netanyahu bloc, the numbers are not shifting so much between the blocks. But Eisenkot is definitely gaining at the expense of, who we thought a few months ago that could be Netanyahu's main rival, Naftali Bennett. It doesn't mean that he will not be prime minister. And it seems, at least according to some reporting, that in very traditional Likud towns, Dimona and other places, that Eisenkot is more popular. There is this whole, which I'm very saddened to be speaking about in 2026, but this idea of what's his heritage, the fact he's Moroccan by descent, gives him points in different sectors in Israel today, which I think is very unfortunate. But but this is the sad reality. And the fact that I think he's very authentic and people believe him, which is something that is so missing today in Israel. So it's obviously too early to say. 90-something days before elections in Israel, it's eternity. A lot of things can change here.
Yes.
But for now, he looks like he's gaining, and it's not just his party that is, I think, around whatever Likud is polling or a little more, but also in terms of like who's more suitable to be prime minister,
which is
Netanyahu, and he's gaining there also.
Yeah, which is key. That's a really good summary, Shira, and a great start. And yes, in terms of your anecdote about the conference, knowing many former senior Israeli officers, they're not ones for humility and not ones to actually admit that they don't know, everything about anything. So it's a very nice anecdote, and having spent some time with them, not as much time as you have, I can attest to the fact that there is a kind of quiet strength, quiet leadership quality to him. He's not one to give these kind of rousing speeches. rah-rah, but he does connect with people on a one-to-one basis, and obviously his personal background, his personal story. And like you said, you don't reach the position he's at, well, now and in the past, by being, a child, or naive, a weakling. So it's interesting. Dan, let's bring you in. What do you think of Eisenkot's rise as, the main challenger now to Bibi?
I think it matters, but I think it doesn't matter all that much, to the extent that the only thing that matters is your ability to affect the block's balance. And as long as this is intra-block dynamics, mainly, and actually, if you look at the numbers closely, if I'm not mistaken, and you had Dalia here in past episodes, shameless plug, go back, to our listeners and still pick it up, because I think it's still relevant. I think what tilts a little bit, or tends to tilt the blocks a bit more, is actually which parties cross the threshold in which poll and which parties do not.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the real action that affects block calculation. It's slightly less so his rise in the polls. So having said that, obviously there are dynamics between him and Bennett, and him and Lapid, and certainly Gantz factors in one way or another. But before that, to the extent that we want to dive into these calculations, worth noting that historically, Netanyahu has been haunted by Israel's generals. I think it was Amir Tibon, maybe I'm mistaken, that about a decade or two ago wrote a piece about Netanyahu and the generals, right? His almost eternal clash, with dating back to Itzik Mordechai and Amnon Lipkin-Shachak, right, in tenure in the 90s, and then obviously being defeated by Ehud Barak in the 99 elections, and then going forward, facing all kinds of challenges from Amram Mitzna and Ami Ayalon, though Mitzna was more against Sharon, doesn't matter, and also Ami Ayalon, and a series of generals that came, and Netanyahu has become so efficient and proficient in ultimately beating them, sometimes through coercion or just flat out beating them, sometimes bringing them in, like Barak. He has his ways. So as exciting as Eisenkot's both rise and prominence is, and a fresh breath, we said he is anti-Netanyahu. He's also the anti-Barak in ways, right? He grew up in Eilat, not in the kibbutzim. He grew up in Golani, not in Sayeret Matkal,
or the paratroopers,
etc. Yes, he wasn't anointed, right? And so as exciting as that is, I would not count out Netanyahu and his ability to withstand whatever is coming.
That is always a good rule of thumb, and we're going to get to Bibi in just a second. But I liked your point about the generals kind of running against Netanyahu. It's been true, like you said, for 30 years. And by the way, not just kind of generals from labor or the left. You also have like Itzik Mordechai from the center right. And it's interesting to me that if you go back and look, literally every chief of staff, going back pretty much for 30 years, has eventually gone public. The ones that actually entered politics, and a lot of them entered politics, they've gone public and they've actually gone very anti-Netanyahu and become very critical of Bibi. And this is literally almost every chief of staff. And you could have Dan Chalutz, who's now pretty much an activist. You have Bogi Ya'alon, who's a Likud hardline right-winger, or former Likud, and now he's the biggest anti-Netanyahu critic. And even now, most recently, Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister under Bibi, who was fired by Bibi twice, once successfully, and is now out there again being critical of Netanyahu. So it is very interesting, this dynamic, Bibi against the generals, and yeah, Benny Gantz was the more recent one, and Benny Gantz, it's not that he was defeated by Netanyahu, he just surrendered to Netanyahu on a number of occasions. So that's Benny Gantz's own journey, as the kids say. But Gadi Eisenkot, I think, is made out of kind of different material.
And obviously, if you want to expand the scope, you had former heads of Shin Bet coming out against Netanyahu and former heads of Mossad coming out against Netanyahu. By now, it's a whole lot of a full spectrum of security officials, high ranking, effectively serving as an opposition to Netanyahu. But with this social political landscape, and one that diminishes the importance of expertise and professional gravitas, that carries much less than it had, in past decades, 70s, 80s.
And I'll do you one better. And Shira, I'd love to get your perspective on this. You see Netanyahu's campaign, and really there's essentially only three elements to it, right? Trying to address the rise of Eisenkot. And you look at the polls, Netanyahu and his kind of bloc, his current far-right ruling coalition with Betzalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, then the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredis, definitely down in the polls. They're underwater. They don't have a clear, anywhere near 61-seat majority, according to the polls in the next Knesset after the next election. So what is Netanyahu saying? He's saying, number one, like he said against every opponent for 30 years, Eisenkot is left-wing. Eisenkot is left. Eisenkot is weak. Eisenkot will go with the Arabs, essentially. That's been true now for 30 years. Doesn't matter who the opposition candidate is. Left, weak, Arabs. Number two, that Eisenkot basically would have stopped the war prematurely, according to Netanyahu, and that he's a defeatist, and that he wouldn't have, we wouldn't have done all these remarkable things across the Middle East, killing Nasrallah, killing Sinwar, killing Khamenei, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Eisenkot is a defeatist and gets things wrong. He wanted to stop the war, and Bibi wanted, obviously, to continue. Number three, and this is the most interesting one, it goes back to Dan's point about the generals. Bibi is running against the IDF, right? In recent weeks, if you listen carefully to his speeches and the interviews that he gives, he's asked, what's the biggest change since October 7th? And his answer over the past 2 or 3 weeks has been, the biggest change is that we're now a state with an army and not an army with a state. A state with an army, not an army with a state. And essentially, we, the politicians, me, essentially, Bibi, is the one that is proactive, takes the initiative, goes on the offensive, and the generals, whether current or recent or former, are the weaklings. And that's fascinating. Shira, what do you make of this campaign, and are people buying it?
So, I think it's too early to say what people are buying or not buying. I think it is important to note that Netanyahu made an awful joke in the beginning when he was first asked this question of what changed since October 7, and he said that he lost a little bit of weight.
Yes.
Which prompted a lot of families of people who were murdered also on October 7, but also killed in the war since then, saying about how their families shed also a lot of weight because of people dying.
Or the hostages held in tunnels being starved.
Right. So, just the lack of sensitivity to what has changed. Of course, since then he changed to what you say, but defeatist, right? Hesitant, leftist, will work with the Arabs are basically the same thing. It's basically just describing what he claims he is not. You need to be a social psychologist to understand what people are convinced and not. But I think to what Dan said earlier, there are two things that I think are important. The first one is that I don't think the blocks are changing so much. If you are a supporter of Bibi, it doesn't matter what the campaign is. Remember, I think President Trump had the same thing, right? Essentially, I can get away with anything, right? People who want to vote for Bibi will vote for Bibi. And people who want to vote for some other parties that will definitely form a coalition that could resemble what we have today are not going to be, I think, convinced either way by a good campaign or not a good campaign. What you have here is a very, very small, it's probably, we're talking about, and maybe Dan knows the numbers better, and I'm sure Dalia, who's an expert on this, knows the numbers. We're talking about very few mandates here and there, and depending on who actually goes out to vote, that could be changed. and I'm not convinced that anything that Netanyahu says will help him shift someone who wants to vote for Bennett or for Eisenkot to all of a sudden vote for Netanyahu. It could be that he can convince those people who are now, not sure, contemplating, have been Likud all their lives, and their grandparents and their parents, right? Like that's what they're born. And they're like, oh, I'm going to change finally because the situation is really not good and the cost of living and, everything that Israelis have been gone through. And then Netanyahu says those things and it'd be like, you know what? He's right. I will stay where I am, where I came from. I think this is what Netanyahu is aiming for, those people who are considering ditching the bloc and moving. He will not be able with this campaign to convince anyone else. And another thing that I think is important, because so many of Israelis' decision makers have been the generals throughout life. We can generalize and talk about how Netanyahu treated them. But if you look at pretty much everyone that worked with Netanyahu throughout the years, even civilians, many of them have already also became staunch opponents of Netanyahu. Sure. So he has a good way of making people come work with him and then turning them into his strong opponents, having seen it from the inside. So
that's also a good point. Dan? Yeah, a couple of things as we segue into the not prediction, not full-on prediction, but like analyzing forward. So first of all, I'm reminding us that Bibi doesn't have to win. All he has to do is not lose. One. Number two, I think more than the campaign themselves, there are contextual issues that will be very dominant here. There are three things that are still, too early to tell. One is the choice architecture, right? Who runs with who and what is the ultimate party, makeup? What's the choice before the voters? It still hasn't consolidated.
Right. And
yet.
And
we have this...
No, sorry, I was just going to interject. You do hear from people, it's like, who are you voting for? This is a question I ask everybody these days, because it cuts to the chase, right? It's like, I don't care about your opinions. If the election was tomorrow, who are you voting for? And that will explain their mindset and where they're coming from. And a lot of people say, I don't know yet, undecided.
Mm-hmm. So there's undecided. Part of the fact that they're undecided is because, the parties haven't consolidated yet. And usually, it's the center right where these dynamics really come to the fore, and we'll see who runs with who. That's number one. Number two is the mechanics of this. The mechanics feed into, for example, how many people have already left Israel, even though they haven't, fully declared so. Are they planning to come back? Will they be able to come back and vote, et cetera, et cetera? We're talking about a few seats that are still undecided whether they're able to come and vote and whether the polling right now actually can capture that. But ultimately, I still think there's a lot of events, geopolitical events, external and internal, to happen that could happen between now and election day. And and I still believe that it is more about what will happen between now and election day than what has happened until now that will ultimately tilt the balance between the blocs.
So everything's still to play for. And yes, even though the polls show, kind of a clear majority for the anti-Netanyahu opposition, they're not quite there in terms of, a full absolute majority over 61 seats. The big difference, though, now compared to the endless rounds of elections that we had between 2019 and 2022, right, is that they're not running neck and neck. So there is an option, even if Eisenkot, say, for example, in the Netanyahu bloc, don't get to 61 seats, that they can change the government with just a simple majority. You don't need 61 seats to actually form a government or seat a government, just need an actual majority. And this is even before the question of whether they'll actually be willing to use the hands and the votes of the Arab Israeli political parties. Again, there's still plenty of time to get into that. I mean, we should never count out Netanyahu. But I'm curious, I want to get your sense. Have you, obviously the three of us come from a certain milieu, shall we say, here in Israel. Again, I'm not going to ask you who you're voting for, but I have a sense who you're not voting for. fair to say we're not huge fans of the current Israeli government. But do you spend a lot of time, have you spoken to people who are pro the current government? And how do you understand it for yourselves that the support has still remained constant, even or despite what we've gone through over now 3.5 years? Shira, should we start with you, or Dan? Feel free.
I'll be very brief. Go ahead. Okay, I'll be very brief. My friends on that side of the aisle, most of which are religious Zionists, their biggest criticism is obviously the internal dynamic has to do with ultra-Orthodox conscription.
It's the biggest issue right now.
Draft or exempt. Yes.
Biggest issue right now.
That is their main criticism. But when it comes to like the big ideological and geopolitical questions of national security in its external manifestation, the hawkish posture, whatever, to them it is clear, right, who they trust to remain hawkish and on the offense and preferring military actions to diplomacy and political processes, and they'll stick with them. When they look at the change bloc, they see the diversity, right, and alignment with Yair Golan and Yair Lapid for them is a treifa. It is something that you don't do when the security of Israel is on the line. So in that regard, as much as they don't trust Bibi and they have all the criticism associated with the rifts with the ultra-Orthodox and whatnot, on this question, they are clear-cut on that side of the aisle.
Shira?
Friends and acquaintances on the other side who are not necessarily coming from a religious theologist perspective, but more from a hawkish perspective. I think there are probably like two types. One is that those who think Bibi is sort of a league of his own, and we could talk about the list of achievements on, who's going to deal with Trump, who's going to deal with this, who's going to do all these great things we are seeing at the moment. And they blame Gadi Eisenkot and Yair Lapid and others and Lieberman for not joining in with Netanyahu and saying the current coalition is a result of them saying anything but Bibi. So still, it's more like the best thing would be a sort of a Zionist, a joint government with Netanyahu in the helm. And it's their fault we got to where we got. Because, we don't necessarily like those crazy, but what can Netanyahu do if you boycott? This is still an argument that is happening.
Yeah, this is the argument.
And I think
this is the argument. We need to save Bibi from himself and the extremists.
In their argument, they're saying, and I think that's what brought Gadi Eisenkot, who we started with, and Benny Gantz is a different story. But when they joined the emergency cabinet after October 7. The idea was like, we love the country more than we hate Netanyahu, right? So that's what they're still saying. Okay, you don't like Netanyahu, fine, but do you love your country? To save the country, what we all need to do is come together. So this is still an argument that I'm hearing a lot, to forcing their hand to do this, because Netanyahu is really the experienced one. We can't have someone now who doesn't have executive experience, with all due respect to the others, as they say. If that's your argument, we will never have a different prime minister, right? Because, of course, Netanyahu is the most experienced one, just by the sheer number of years. And others, I think, they buy into this idea that the list of, there's a lot of protests, the activists, right? If you look at the Democrats, a party we haven't spoken about now, but it's the Yair Golan list. And Yair Golan is also like an extremely brave fighter. He's perceived as very leftist. I will tell you he's not. And a spoiler also, he came to an IPF event once in the US, and I think the audience was quite shocked when he spoke about the annexation of the Jordan Valley and other things that stand in the way of a traditional two-state solution. Yeah,
you're making news. You're undermining his campaign. But no, you're right. He's not.
I'm actually strengthening his campaign.
Yeah, well, depends who you ask. But yes,
depends who the audience is. But I will say that. But his list, right? You have all these the leaders of the protest that People say, wait, they were part of the protest, and how can we have people who refuse to serve because of the legal reform? You remember the judicial coup?
This was in 2023.
Right, before October 7th. And obviously all these people, thank goodness that they exist, because they helped save the country when this government and it's not a political statement, but the fact is that a lot of unprofessional people running it and working there, because a lot of civil servants left, right? These people, what you have, the NGO sector, civil society, many of their leaders are now trying to get to go to the Knesset, have saved the country, really, and came to the rescue. So we'll see. I don't see, but I don't have anyone. And I think when you're saying about the undecided, I have friends who are contemplating between Yair Golan and Avigdor Lieberman and Gadi Eisenkot, but I don't have anyone who says like, oh, maybe I'll vote for Smotrich or Bennett, or maybe Bibi, or maybe Gadi. I don't know these people. I know the more within the blocks, the shifts.
Right. And, we should say, we're going to touch on them in just a second. The Democrats are basically, it's the amalgamation of the old Labor Party and the left-wing Meretz Party. And Yair Golan, thankfully and, belatedly merged them together, took the top spot, and they just had their primaries, 2 days ago? Earlier this week. So it was a strong list by all accounts. They're polling at 10, 11 seats in the polls, which is a resurrection, nothing less for the Israeli left. And it's, combination of kind of existing labor, solid kind of members of Knesset and the activists, and a few kind of old time IDF types, left-wing IDF types. I'll just sum up the issue of people still contemplating voting for Netanyahu, the Likud, or the government. I know a lot of them, some of them quite closely. And look, I think some of them are just true believers, right? And this is maybe difficult for people outside of Israel to kind of understand, but they blame October 7th and even the protests for 9 months before October 7th with regard to the judicial overhaul as solely on the other side. They blame the army for messing up on the morning of October 7th. They blame the protest movement for, as you alluded to, Shira, you had this phenomenon of reservists kind of suspending their reserve duty and protest at Israel going kind of authoritarian due to these judicial reforms, judicial overhaul gambit. So everything that happens, it's never on Netanyahu. It's never on the government. And there's never any sense of responsibility. The world is angry at this or that action, whether in Gaza or elsewhere. Well, the world is anti-Semitic. There's never any real kind of self-reflection. The Iran war was between a defeat and a fiasco and kind of an incomplete grade. No, it's an absolute good that we were bombing Iran and that we killed Khamenei. Okay. That's a perspective. That's a prism. So for anyone kind of curious how Netanyahu is still polling as high as he's polling, I think that's the core of his support, combined with this massive propaganda pseudo media machine that really has penetrated to a great deal. And this is a fairly recent phenomenon, in combination with kind of undermining trust in the traditional mainstream media. You see like the messages being parroted back at you after every kind of broadcast on Channel 14.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals Initiative, IPF Atid, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
I'm curious to get a sense, the Israeli left, people who we know and love, what do we think of the new and improved, the Democrats, this new party, this new list? Dan, is this a new Israeli left?
It's a consolidated Israeli left to a certain extent, empowered by the protest movement of 23 and the energy, the momentum, the institutions, pseudo-institutions, formal and informal, that it had created. It's been quite impressive in the polls, polling at low double digits for a while now, and I think their fate will ultimately, their electoral fate, right? Not coalition fate, but their electoral fate will ultimately depend on how the rest of the electoral map shapes before the elections and what the choice architecture is for their potential voters. I will say that they do resonate beyond their bloc because statements that they can produce can deter few people who do, hang between, say, Eisenkot and Bibi. Not many are those, or people that hang between Netanyahu and Trooper Handel. So and Yair Golan's statements tend to really make waves in the WhatsApp groups of the other side. So when it comes to them, I think the campaign that they will run can influence ultimately the electoral map.
By the way, just for our audience, Handel Trooper, this is this new kind of right-wing party that's now over the electoral threshold, polling around 4 seats. Yoaz Handel, former aide to Netanyahu, Chili Trooper, he's one of the self-exiles from Benny Gantz's party. So he broke with Benny Gantz once he realized it was a sinking ship. So they've joined forces. It's kind of based on reservists, but they're right-wing, and they're one of the ones who are calling for a broad coalition government after the next election, a broad Zionist government, where their phrase, we want to impose this on both sides. I don't know. It's always a question of who's going to be number one, and if Bibi's number one, then why does he have any interest in preserving their broad Zionist coalition for longer than 2 minutes? But anyway, we'll get to that before Election Day, I'm sure. That's Handel and Chili Topel. Shira, what do you think of our friends on the left, the Democrats?
I mean, I agree with Dan. A lot of names we know, have been around for a long time. I appreciated, the open primaries. I appreciate the fact that it's what do you call a zipper list? It's a men, women, so it's half and half. By the way, we're seeing also that Gadi Eisenkot he's joined by many, or not many, but at least as equal number of women, I think, experts to his list. And Naftali Bennett, I think even more. So this will be a correction, because for those of you who noticed or didn't notice, there are very few women in Israeli decision-making today, the political rank, but also among the professionals. No director generals of government ministries and in other sectors as well. So, it's I agree, good people, but they come with a certain a clear tag of being, very much on the left, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's no hiding, right? This ambiguity as to what they stand for does not exist, whereas Gadi Eisenkot can still keep this ambiguity. I'm not sure, views-wise, there's such big differences between Gadi himself and Yair Golan. As I said, Yair Golan is not. People think it's just a perception. You should have heard him speak about, different regions in Lebanon that we should keep forever. Yeah. I don't think people understand what he's quite hawkish on several issues, and he's really a military person. And, he's been very like a military through a security lens looking at a variety of things. You have professionals on this list. I don't know what to say about them anymore. I will just say on the Chili Trooper and Yoaz Hendel, and now Shiran Haskel, who was the deputy foreign minister, who all of a sudden decided this is like a one straw too many, and she has to resign exactly now when we go to elections. And I think she's also launching a new party. Yeah. I think all these small actors are doing it to be bought, to be acquired, to be merged with the big ones. Right, Chili Trooper himself, I think he left Benny Gantz when he said he's not going to be part of a party that doesn't cross the electoral threshold. So if he's polling very near to it, I just don't know that he was. So I think these are small actors that at this moment they could be meaningful, but they could also be completely meaningless within days. And we will know more as this campaign continues.
Yeah, as always, as Dan mentioned at the top, I'm gonna steal a phrase from Dan's world in baseball. We can talk all the time, and the focus is on the top of the standings, but really, where Israeli elections are decided is the bottom of the standings. It's the smaller parties, whether they make it over the electoral threshold, the very fine margins where these things come down and are decided. And Shira, I like the fact that you've now undermined not only Yair Golan's campaign, but also Gadi Eisenkot's campaign. This is good. Making news and making waves.
Wait, you said that I strengthened their campaigns. I'm just saying
not at
that
all.
they're people. No, in a sense that I said that Gadi is humble and that he asks professionals. That is, and Yair also. I'm just going to say, I think it's very compelling. By the way, we spoke about Bibi, right? Tagging people as leftists, defeatists, and stuff. And I just think there is much more nuance to all of them on different issues. Okay, than is convenient for either their competitors, but also for their voters to know. And I think nuance, right? You at IPF, you celebrate nuance, should be appreciated and respected. So sure. I hope I strengthen their campaign because I'm explaining they're more complex creatures than being just like leftists.
No, 100%. And even in the profile I wrote of Eisenkot that came out on Monday, right? He had one statement. He's giving an interview to Israeli television. He's like, never in my 66 years have I uttered the words Palestinian state. Okay. He was also for most of those years in uniform. So it's not his position to advocate for or against a Palestinian state. But then in another interview that same night, he was asked, and this is to his credit, he's against annexation. He's for separation from the Palestinians. And he had a quote that said, the idea of annexing 2.8 million Palestinians, i.e. in the West Bank, is a threat to the Zionist project and is a threat to Israel's existence as both a Jewish and democratic state. This is a classic kind of left-wing, center-left position to take. It also happens to be objectively true. So the fact that he came out and vocalized that, I'm sure did not make his campaign managers happy, but to your point, Shira, it's actually kind of telling the truth to the Israeli public before an election, let alone.
And the fact that this is leftist. I mean, it's the right is so right that it's left, because if you think that by preventing a Palestinian state, you're also going to prevent Israel as a Zionist dream. Yeah. Right? Like they think that they're preventing, a Palestinian state. You're preventing Israel's state as a Jewish state. And that is why this idea of calling it left and right, it's like what's left and what right. We all want to share together, hold hands here, sing kumbaya. Which resources we all have to absorb and pay for the rights of 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, do we have more resources of income? And I think that the fact that he's candid and explains that, basically saying that they're not going anywhere, and we have to find a way to. Cope with this complex reality is not a bad thing, but I wouldn't put them as leftist. By the way, I'm hearing that also Lieberman doesn't want to control the lives of the Palestinians forever, and he says that. And Lieberman is by no means a leftist, and he lives in the settlement. And Naftali Bennett, who's definitely not a leftist, right? And he was the head of the Yesha Council, the settlements. He also believes in some sort of like gradual partitions or separation and having self-rule for the Palestinians. So yeah, he says autonomy, and I know that autonomy in the legal term is part of a one state. But I think this idea of separation, if we can't even say that today, we've gone too far in the Israeli discourse.
Well, we've definitely gone too far in the Israeli discourse. That's to say the least, given recent years. And I mean, ultimately, like let's call it what it is, right? Under Netanyahu's long reign, the leadership has not leveled with the Israeli public. There'll be a lot to talk about, like I said, for the next couple weeks and months about Israeli politics. I wanted to shift with our remaining time to a few big geopolitical issues. So the big news overnight from our friends at the Wall Street Journal was that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are set to sign a nuclear agreement where U.S. companies will help Saudi set up its own civilian nuclear program with, quote unquote, potentially less stringent inspection obligations and potentially, uranium enrichment on Saudi soil, which would be a big sea change. Shira, let's start with you. What did you think of this news that broke? I mean, I think such a deal between the U.S. and Saudi was talked about for a number of years now as part of this overall package to entice Saudi to actually normalize relations with Israel. And now we're seeing it kind of just being done by the Trump administration for contracts for American nuclear companies.
So first of all, I just want to say something from a U.S. perspective. And before I go to the criticism of this agreement, what it means from Israel, and the bottom line up front is it's a colossal diplomatic failure for Israel. But from a U.S. perspective, I understand why they would do it. Because, we love talking about these other issues, but there is a nuclear race, and it's not the nuclear arms race. There's a nuclear renaissance. Nuclear power is all the rage, especially to power data centers around the world. And this race, the Americans have been losing for many years because America's just stopped producing nuclear technology. The Russians are in the lead. Chinese are behind them. I've worked a lot on this issue. I'm very passionate about it. And from a perspective of a U.S. Competition, that it's not just economic. I know it could be tempting to put it all on sort of like, what are the American making out of this money? Money is part of it, but it's really a geopolitical issue, a competition that goes to the core of U.S. Peer competition, rivalry, global power, whatever you want to call it, with the Chinese and the Russians. And if we look at the Russian model of how the nuclear power plant, in Turkey, and there's in Egypt, and there are others. And for the U.S. to want to make sure that the Saudis are tied to the U.S. and they don't go with China, which the Saudis might do because it's a matter of energy needs and nuclear and prestige, right? And other issues. So from a U.S. perspective, not just the economic stuff, but the other considerations, I very much understand why they would want to tie the Saudis with them. It's too early to say whether, and we don't have time to go into the details, but there's the gold standard agreement, like the UAE signed, United Arab Emirates. Mm-hmm. Which is sort of with the most guardrails, right? You would have most guardrails and extra protocol. It doesn't look like the Saudis are going for the same type of agreement here. So it's less guardrails, no additional protocol, which means less like supervision. And here come questions about the dual use nature of nuclear technology that could be converted gradually, and the knowledge and the know-how into a military program, which obviously is a whole different issue. There's proliferation of nuclear capabilities, which we don't want. When we are seeing how vulnerable energy sites are in the Gulf now, you think what's going to happen if, God forbid, Iranian missiles or UAVs hit a nuclear facility, mm-hmm. which, by the way, there was a strike next to the Emirati one already. And then there are issues also of saying, regimes can change, right? Saudi is very much in the U.S. orbit now. Things can change. And what are we giving? These are all the considerations. But I think from an Israeli perspective, For years, we knew that a primary incentive, not the only one, but a primary incentive for normalizing ties with Israel was this idea that the Saudis get sort of like more types of access to more capabilities, military capabilities than before, and this nuclear agreement. And Biden had negotiated exactly the same deal, just with a tiny thing, that it comes with normalization with Israel.
Yep.
I have to tell you, and here I'm just going to give you another anecdote, not from an Israeli. About a year and a half ago, or maybe even more, I was somewhere in a conference internationally, and I met a very senior Saudi person from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, their ministry, and they said that they're going to get it, the nuclear agreement, this time without a normalization. And I was skeptical. And so this has been in the making for a long time. Maybe this was the momentum of appeasing the Saudis at a time where there's some, I don't know if there's strains, but there are issues obviously with the fact that they're being undermined and attacked by the Iranians with a war that they didn't want. So I'm not sure about the timing of this, but this has been a long time in the making. And there are reports now in the New York Times, and there have been reports a few months ago that Israel is raising its objections about this. But I can tell you, and this I heard also with IPF folks, that on Congress in the last few years, people very close to Netanyahu have told Congress that there's no issues and Israel would support it, because there was always the assumption that it would come with the price of normalization with the Saudis. And I'll end with this. So Israel is opposing now, but insinuated at least, and I heard in stronger terms that Israel said they have no problem with it, that the Saudi can have it. And not only that Saudis are not normalizing ties with Israel, they already, and everything we're hearing, as they told Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, and Hamad al-Shara of Syria, not to normalize ties with Israel. So they're also holding back others from doing this. And I guess, and if I don't know if we want to rate like the diplomatic failures of the last few years, I would probably put it in top 5.
Very, very interesting. And maybe the Saudis, like many other people across the Middle East, and not just the Middle East, are waiting essentially for a new Israeli government to do business with. Dan,
Sorry, and I'm sure, by the way, I want to say, I think from Saudis, it's not normalization, I hope, is a matter of when and not if. I don't think this was the only incentive. There are a lot of interest in regional integration, and things can change with the Saudis. But there was, Dan and I talk about, I'm sure, Dan, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I don't think there was a Saudi urgency before, but there's not going to be a Saudi urgency to that now.
Yeah, this hurts. This hurts because there was such an opportunity, right? And the more we look at it in retrospective, more we recognize the opportunities that was there in the late spring and summer and early fall of 23. Everything was integrated and related to each other, right? The Saudis wanting a treaty level like security relationship that includes commitment and capacities, and also this nuclear file. But it had ultimately had to come down. And to get the Congress, you need a Democratic president, and you need Netanyahu and Dermer lobbying Republicans to support this thing. And ultimately, to get everything lined up, you needed a Palestinian component, and a meaningful Palestinian component. And that was the missing ingredient, because many people on the U.S. side and on the Israeli side assumed that all you needed is something, a statement toward the Palestinians.
Magic words.
Which was not the case, right? Just the fact that, some Americans, Shira once told me, spent 3 hours with MBS and came back to Washington and never heard about the Palestinian issue during those 3 hours didn't mean that ultimately that the Saudis won't need something meaningful. And obviously after October 7th, a window was still there, but the price of that Palestinian component has risen significantly, and it will remain high. And by now, Netanyahu himself is probably a persona non grata, in terms of normalization. And if the Saudis can get most of the things that they want without having to pay the cost of normalizing with Israel, then why would they? Remains to be seen what happens with the next Israeli government. But I would urge everybody involved not to underestimate Saudi needs on the Palestinian matter, or the next opportunity will also be missed.
Very much agree with that sentiment. And look, it's a question of Israeli choices as well. We've heard people like Bezalel Smotrich, senior minister in the current Israeli government, say if it's a choice between all of the land and Saudi, and he had some very not nice words to say about Saudi, I think, in that particular statement, he's choosing the West Bank, the land of Israel.
That's okay. By the way, that's I disagree with this, but it's a legitimate argument to make. The problem is that those, on the hawkish side of Israel, and there are many of them, right, who are not theologically committed to Greater Israel, etc., have the wrong equation in their mind of what it ultimately takes to reach normalization with Saudi Arabia. And the first thing for us, as think tank people trying to impact the discourse and the understanding across the board, is to reconfigure and sharpen, the needs for such a breakthrough, and be very clear. It doesn't need to be a Palestinian state tomorrow or even soon, but it needs to be a meaningful component that projects across the board that Israel is serious on progressing with the Palestinian issue. And I believe if that's the case, Israel will also see a Palestinian partner in Ramallah that can work with it on a process, a roadmap, focusing initially on improving the stabilizing situation in the West Bank, and obviously stabilizing Gaza and moving it along the 20-point plan. This does not need to be a frog leap necessarily toward Palestinian statehood right here and now.
Sorry, this is so important because, we talk about the Saudi needs on this. It happens that those things that are really in the Israeli interest, not that's just the regional component, the regional integration that Israel needs so badly. A competent, right? We spoke about it before, right? Like not what they call revitalized PA, not RPA, CPA, a competent Palestinian state. God forbid, Palestinian Authority, not state, competent Palestinian Authority that delivers services for their people, that cooperates with Israel in security and is accountable for the security risks that emerge from the territories that it controls, that obviously does not incite to violence in different ways. This is an Israeli interest. And, we speak about the Saudis. I think what was so lost on the Israeli public, and it's going to be a year to this in September, maybe we can have an episode, Neri, but the Saudi-French initiative, which in Israel, all the play was about, Gewalt recognition by different European countries of a Palestinian state. But they missed the part that came with it, which was the Saudi-French, the New York Declaration with the Saudi and French led, but it was written in consultation with different people. And there's text there that is almost a dream come true to the Israelis, right? Acceptance of Israel, rejection of Hamas, rejections of terrorism. And so I really think this is not just to give this to the Saudis so we can get something from them. It's the opportunity is there, and I hope will still be there. But this was a big right. This was a big incentive for the Saudis, and with us assuming that time always works on our side, this is another proof that this is not the reality.
Yeah. And by the way, just for our audience, MBS is Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, and the 20-point plan is obviously the Donald Trump authored 20-point plan that ended the war in Gaza and the ceasefire and everything that's come on in the months since. I wanted to get your takes because I'd be remiss if I didn't have two experts on Gaza on this podcast and not ask them what's the latest with regard to Gaza. Shira's already shaking her head. Do you want to start us off, Shira? Like, we heard yesterday that the Board of Peace wants to launch this pilot humanitarian and governance zone in Rafah in South Gaza. What do you think is happening actually on the ground with regard to ceasefire deal, reconstruction, something?
It's good we're not playing poker now, Neri, because I think anyone who sees my face can very clearly see that I can't keep my poker face. Nothing is happening. Okay, I'll just be very blunt about it. Humanitarian areas, bubbles, zones in Rafah is something I've heard of since December 2023.
Yeah.
2023.
Yeah.
Okay. In different shapes or forms. The Board of Peace wants to do this. There's no question they want to do this. What has in fact advanced in the meantime in terms of financial resources, tendering, clearing the space, getting the approvals from Israel? Who will control this? Is it then a technocratic exiled government waiting in a hotel in Cairo to enter when and if Hamas says, yes, take our arms or not? None of this has happened yet. And I have to tell you, and I think a lot of it depends on this like Hamas disarmament question, which we can have a whole episode about. Actually, you did have one, but I think there's a question what this means. And I hope there's a different approach for this question. But it's very difficult for me to see that Netanyahu, with Israeli public that is frustrated about what's happening with Iran. I mean, it's clearly not a better situation for Israel at the moment, with real risks of Iran that could have emerged stronger from the campaign. Lebanon. There's this Israeli fear of Trump forcing Israel to withdraw from Lebanon and from Syria in the next few weeks. I don't think it would be a bad thing, but in Israel, it's, and now this Saudi news. To imagine that Netanyahu's government would be able to give permits to anything that looks like improving the lives of Palestinians in Gaza, I think to me, it's the Board of Peace is dreaming. Whether they can do this and promote some things in preparation for after the elections, whether it's Netanyahu or a different government to promote this, maybe. But I don't see anything that is happening positively in Gaza at the moment, except that Israel, the IDF, is taking more territory. So effective control of territory in Gaza stands at around probably between 65 and 70% of territory. In the meantime, Hamas controls a shrinking part of Gaza, but virtually all the people.
Yeah.
Humanitarian crisis that continues, despite aid that is coming in, and we don't have time to get into this, but really humanitarian crisis and humanitarian conditions that are suffering. There are some challenges to Hamas's rule, but they're not as challenging as I think we would have liked to see. And you still have the de facto as Hamas, weakened, but definitely not gone. And Israel that is waiting for elections to decide what we are going to do about Gaza.
Decide what it wants to be when it grows up. Dan, final thoughts with regard to Gaza?
I tend to agree. Fully agree. Gaza is deadlocked and gridlocked. Deadlocked on the question of Hamas disarmament, and gridlocked because everything else awaits that issue. So that's basically where we're stuck. And as the players and Shira alluded to it, I'll be her anger translator. So as the key actors involved turn inward to think and plan of what should come after a new Israeli government is in place, I would urge them to not just think that the change in government will in and of itself be the breakthrough that will unleash all the goodies that are awaiting Gaza in the plans and files of the Boards of Peace and other who want to plan the better future for Gaza and Israel, I should say. But there needs to be some real strategic recalibration of what is at play here, how to approach the question of disarming Hamas. This is not just about the mechanics. This is about the basic motivation of that organization and what it perceives to be permissible on both national and religious grounds to do. Also, the ability to move forward ultimately, runs through the participation of the PA, on the ground in small measures that Shira can list way better than I can initially, but ultimately also politically, pending reforms and pending the reorganization of internal Palestinian politics and dynamics. All this has to be in play, or Gaza will not move forward. I'll stop here.
And if I'm angry, sorry, I didn't mean to be angry. I'm passionate about this because I also think that apropos, opportunities after this horrible, horrendous war, right? There is an opportunity in Gaza. We can question some parts of the 20-point plan that Dan mentioned before, but overall, there's a good plan. Maybe the assumptions have to be tested, but we have to understand there's nothing else better that awaits us, right? And sort of stalling doesn't again play in our favor, and this is why my frustration is there. And when we speak about the changes you want to see in Gaza, obviously keeping Gaza's population
hemmed in.
In the living conditions they live now is not going to create the future generation of Zionists.
No, it's not. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about Gaza. Maybe we should just do an episode just on that, and maybe as we get closer to the 3-year mark of October 7th, and also the 1 year mark of ceasefire. We'll definitely be talking about that, and the Israeli elections as well. Shira, Dan, thank you so much for your time. I will be sure to send this episode to Michael Koplow so he sees and hears what he has missed, and hopefully he'll come back rejuvenated, and we'll up his game. No, I'm kidding. He's great.
Michael rejuvenated Koplow, definitely.
But he only has one gear though. Rejuvenated Koplow. It doesn't. It's like an oxymoron. He has one gear, and that's
I know,
Koplow.
That's what I'm saying. It's not exactly his middle name.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk to you both.
Sorry.
We'll talk to you guys soon. Okay. Thanks again to Shira Efron and Dan Rothem for their generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and our editor, Tracy Levy, as always. And to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work, do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and please subscribe and spread the word.